My daughter Patty came back from the berry patch that August afternoon carrying a half-empty pail and a look on her face that I had never seen in 9 years of raising her. She was not a child who frightened easily. She had been walking that trail to the huckleberry thicket since she was 6 years old, first with me and then on her own, and she knew that. Hillside as farm children know land. They have been permitted to roam not just the path itself but the sound the creek makes at different water levels, which stumps to watch for in the lower reach, where the trail goes muddy, how the light through the second-growth Douglas fir tells you roughly what time it is without a watch. Connie Bell was 9 years old that summer, and she was more capable on that hillside than most grown adults who did not know the country as she did. But she came up the porch steps that afternoon with her bootlaces dragging and her pail swinging loose in one hand, and she set the pail on the railing beside the door with a care that was not her usual motion. Like she was making sure not to make any sudden sounds, she looked at me with those steady brown eyes and said, real quiet, "Mama." Something followed me home from the berry patch. Before we get into it, let me know where you are watching from and if you have ever had an encounter like this. My name is Connie Bell. I am 74 years old, and I have lived most of my life in the Skagit County foothills of western Washington, within earshot of the Cascade Range, and within sight of the logging roads that climb into the old growth above the valley floor. My husband Glenn and I ran a small dairy operation on 80 acres of river bottom land northeast of Hamilton for 31 years. And we raised 2 children there. And we built a life that was ordinary in nearly every way. A life can be ordinary. The daily milking rotation, the seasonal hay cutting, the volunteer fire department suppers on the second Friday of every month, the 4:30 mornings and the long summer evenings when the Pacific Northwest light stayed past 9 and you almost believed you had more time than you did. Hamilton sits at the eastern edge of the Skagit Valley where the flat dairy country bottom of the valley presses up against the first true rise of the Cascades. The mountains do not ease up on you there. They start. One moment you are on valley floor, looking at fields and hedgerows and the big leaf maples lining the riverbank, and the next you are on a gravel road that goes vertical in a few hundred yards and does not level off until you are well above 2,000 feet. The logging roads above our property wound through terrain that had been cut in the late 1950s and early 60s, mostly Douglas fir and western red cedar, and by 1982 those cuts had grown back into dense second-growth tangle, thick enough to close over your head in July and block enough light that the understory ran to sword, fern, and devil's club and the kind of silence that has weight to it. Above the second growth, where the logging roads ended and the old deer trail continued east toward the national forest boundary, the huckleberries came in, Vaccinium membranaceum, which Patty learned to call by name before she was 10, because she was the kind of child who wanted the right word for everything she cared about. The wild huckleberry thickets on our hillside ran from roughly 2,200 feet up to about 3,100, dense and low-growing in the rocky soil, where the timber thinned, and they fruited reliably every August earlier in dry years, later in wet ones, but always August. Always heavy with the small dark blueberries that tasted nothing like the cultivated blueberries at the valley farm stands. Sharper, more complex, with a flavor that I always thought of as the mountains themselves, concentrated into a berry small enough to hold between your thumb and finger. Glenn and I had been picking those thickets since we bought the property in 1975. After Carl was born in the spring of 1981, Patty had taken over the berry runs almost entirely. She was reliable enough by then, and she knew the trail. And I had a 14-month-old who still woke twice in the night and needed more of me than the berry patch did. The arrangement worked. Patty brought the berries home and I made the jam and the pies and put up the quarts we would eat through the winter, and everybody was satisfied with the division of labor. The trail from the farm to the clearing took about 40 minutes at a 9-year-old's pace. Up the logging road, which we had gated at the property line and which was technically still accessible to the Forest Service but had not seen a vehicle in years, then left at the first big cedar snag through about a quarter-mile of second growth, then up again on a deer track that widened in the rocky stretch above the timber line. The clearing was not large, maybe 30 feet across, a natural opening in the huckleberry thicket where an outcropping of granite broke through the thin soil and kept the brush from establishing. The berries grew thick around three sides of it. No trail markers, no other farms visible, no road noise, just the hillside and the August sky and the sound of wind through the fir needles lower down. Patty had made that run alone at least a dozen times already that summer. She knew to start back by 4 o'clock so she would be home before the evening milking prep. She knew to watch for bear sign and give the clearing a wide approach if she found fresh scat nearby. She knew to make enough noise on the trail that a startled deer would not cannon into her on a blind turn. All of this she knew because we had taught her, and because she was the kind of child who absorbed practical instruction and held on to it. The dairy was not large by any commercial standard, but it was ours, and it was sufficient, and the work of it organized every day of our lives from the 4:30 morning milking through the afternoon milking and the evening barn check. Glenn handled most of the heavy physical work, and I handled the books and the house and Carl and the garden that fed us through the summer and into the winter. Patty was old enough to help with small tasks, gathering eggs from the few chickens we kept, feeding the barn cats, the light end of things. And she did those tasks without being asked because she was Patty, and she understood that on a farm, everyone carries a portion. Hamilton, in 1982, was a town of about 300 people. The main road ran through it in 4 minutes at the posted speed limit, past the post office, the hardware store, the tavern, and the small general store that carried everything from seed to canned goods to baling twine, and that also sold fishing licenses, and was generally the place where the men of the valley gathered on Saturday mornings before the work started, in earnest. There was a volunteer fire department that Glenn served on, and a school that Patty attended in Concrete, 12 miles west, because Hamilton's own school had closed a decade before we arrived. The county road ran north and south through the valley, and the gravel roads branched off it into the farms, and the logging roads branched off those into the mountains, and the mountains held everything that happened above the farms, which was where the real history of that terrain lived. We had neighbors we knew and neighbors we did not know much beyond their names. Roy Barnes to the north with his beef operation. The Millers 2 miles south with their blueberry field. Old Walt Chambers directly across the county road, whose family had been farming that ground since before Glenn's father was born, and who knew the upper drainage country as well as anyone alive. Though Walt was in his late 70s and not given to conversation beyond the strictly necessary, we were part of a community of working farms that knew itself and looked after itself and did not require much external infrastructure to function. What infrastructure there was, the co-op, the feed store, the Skagit Valley Herald delivered 3 times a week we used when we needed it and did not think much about when we did not. The life was good. I want to be clear about that. It was not a life of hardship or deprivation, not the version of rural poverty that people project onto farming people who live far from cities. It was a good life, a full life, with its rhythms and its seasons and its reliable pleasures, the first asparagus in April, how the valley looked from the logging road gate on a clear August morning with the river glinting below the fields and the mountains out in full presence to the east, the particular smell of the barn in cold weather, and the particular smell of new grass in spring, and the smell of huckleberry jam reducing on the kitchen stove in August. A good life in a good place. What happened in the fall of that year happened inside that life, alongside it, threaded through the ordinary days like a different kind of thread, present but not replacing anything.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, link's down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
Glenn Bell was 34 years old that August, a tall, broad-shouldered man who had grown up the son of a logger in the upper Skagit drainage and who had inherited from that upbringing a particular quality of quietness that was not shyness and not distance, but simply the temperament of someone who had spent his formative years in country that rewarded observation and penalized noise. He had studied at Bellingham, agricultural science, and come back to the valley because the valley was where he belonged, and he had known that from the time he was old enough to know things about himself. He ran his 80 acres as his father had taught him to run anything worth running, which was with attention to what the land told you and without sentiment about the parts that did not work. We had met at a county fair in Concrete when I was 24 years old and he was 26, and we had been married by the time I was 25 and farming this land by the time I was 26. Carl was our second child. Our first, a pregnancy in 1978, had not made it past the 4th month, and we did not talk about that much, but it was part of the texture of why Patty was who she was to both of us. Not an only child exactly, but a child who had grown up knowing, as children know things without being told, that she was very wanted. The farm itself was typical of the river-bottom dairy operations in that part of Skagit County, good flat ground for the hay fields, a modest milking barn with 12 Holsteins that Glenn had built up, one purchase at a time over 7 years, a separator house, a machine shed, and the farmhouse itself, which had been built in the 1930s and which we had been slowly repairing and improving since we took possession. The Cascade foothills rose behind us to the east, close enough that on clear days we could see the individual tree lines at different elevations. The pale line where the old growth began above the second growth, and above that the rocky ridge line that marked the national forest boundary. On the clearest days of late summer and early fall, with the mountains out in their full presence, you could see snow on the high peaks above the forest, the permanent snowfields that sat up there through even the warmest summers and that sent their meltwater down through the creek systems that watered the valley floor. I had grown up in Skagit County myself, though further west, in the flatter part of the valley closer to Mount Vernon. My parents were not farming people. My father managed a hardware store. My mother worked at the school district offices. But I had spent enough summers with my grandmother in Hamilton that I knew the mountain country from a young age. Knew which creek swam best. Knew which logging road gave you the cleanest view of the glacier on a clear day. Knew that the mountains east of the valley were not decoration but presence, a living wall that shaped the weather and the light and the character of the place in ways that people who had not grown up inside it could not quite understand. By 1982, I had been on this land for 7 years, and I knew it as you know your own body, not with the attention you pay to a new thing, but with the inattention of the deeply familiar. I knew which field corner held the wettest ground in spring, which fence post needed resetting first in autumn, what the dairy cows did before a hard frost and what they did before a thunderstorm and what they did when motion at the edge of perception in the timber above the north pasture. I knew the sounds of this place, and I knew its silences, and I knew, on the 5th evening after Patty's encounter, when I looked up from the dishes at the kitchen window and saw the figure in the alder's gap, that what I was looking at had not arrived suddenly, that whatever it was, it had been here before, in some form or another, for longer than our 7 years on this land, that it was the farm that was new here, not the thing standing at the edge of the trees. She had been gone since right after lunch. When I saw her coming up the farm lane at 4:10 with her pail swinging and her pace wrong, I set Carl's bottle on the counter and went to the back door without quite knowing why. The mother's automatic sweep, knees, hands, face, no blood, no swelling, nothing dragged or broken. But the pace was the thing. I had been watching my daughter walk across that yard for 9 years, and I knew every variation of her gait. The quick bouncing step when she was happy, the deliberate march she did when she was carrying a heavy load, the dragging shuffle that meant she was working through difficulty. This was none of those. This was a walk I had never seen from her. I said, "How was the picking?" She said, "I need to tell you what happened." Patty was not a dramatic child. She tended toward understatement, toward giving you the facts and letting you arrive at the appropriate level of concern on your own. So when she sat down at the kitchen table and started talking slowly, in the careful sequence she used when she wanted to get the details right, I gave her my full attention. I took Carl out of his playpen and held him on my hip, and I stood at the counter and listened. She said it had been about her height, maybe a little shorter. Patty was 4'7" that August, and she said the top of the figure came to roughly her chin. It walked on two legs, upright. The whole time she was aware of it. It was covered head to toe in hair dense and dark, the color of creek mud after a hard rain. Not the fuzz you would see on an animal's face, but actual hair. The same kind of thing you see on a dog's back, but thicker and more uniform. Lying close to the body. Its hands were wrong for the size of the rest of it. The fingers considerably longer than they should have been. The palms wide and heavy-knuckled. The face was not a human face and not an animal's face either. A brow that protruded further than any brow she had seen, overhanging the eyes in a ridge that cast a shadow even in the open light of the clearing. A nose wide and flat, a jaw heavy, set forward in a way that was more pronounced than anything she had a reference for. And the eyes, she said, the eyes, more than once, dark, large for the size of the head, with a quality of attention in them that she had not encountered in any animal she knew. Not the flat, reactive quality of a prey animal's eye, not the fixed, calculating stare of a predator's. In between, and also, neither. She held still when she first saw it. The figure held still, too. In that first 30 seconds of mutual stillness, the fear she expected arrived briefly and then went. Not because she told herself to be calm. It simply went, like a headache that resolves between one breath and the next. And what replaced it was a curiosity, strong enough that she had to actively keep herself from taking a step toward it. She held her open palm out with a handful of huckleberries in it. Not reaching, not advancing, just making the offer visible. The figure sniffed. She heard that a real inhalation, the nose drawing in what her open hand held. Then it came forward 3 steps, and she could see more clearly how it moved. And the thing that struck her most immediately was that it moved well, not with the lurching imbalance of a bear standing upright, not with any sign of effort. It walked on 2 legs with the ease that comes from doing exactly that one's entire life. The weight moved through the hips and knees in a pattern that was biomechanically fluent in a way no human gait quite matches. Because human gait still carries the history of our transition. This moved as if upright had always been the only option, and no transition had ever been required. It took the berries from her palm. She said the hand was warm. She said she felt the warmth before she felt the weight. The fingers were careful. She used that word twice and meant it precisely. Not hesitant, but precise. It took the berries and put them in its mouth and made a sound that she said sat in her chest more than her ears. A brief, low hum that rose slightly at the end, the register of a sound that goes up when a thing is pleased. Then she picked more berries, slowly and methodically, not looking at the figure, giving it space to stay or go without the pressure of being observed. When she glanced up a few minutes later, it had sat down, cross-legged in the granite-edge grass of the clearing, the same posture she would take with a book. It was watching her pick with a patience she said reminded her of Glenn watching her learn to tie the hay bale knot, not bored, not anywhere else, just waiting for her to finish a thing that was hers to finish. She picked for 20 more minutes. It stayed. When she started back down the trail, it stood and came after her, not close 30 feet back, maybe a little more, inside the tree line when the trail broke into open ground. In the open, when the trail ran through timber, it matched her step for step without any apparent effort. When she stopped once to adjust her pail, it stopped too and waited. She did not run. She kept a steady pace to the logging road gate, where the figure stopped at the alder edge and stood and looked at her while she picked up her pace down the gravel and kept going. She looked back once. From about 200 yards down the road, it was still standing in the shade of the alders, watching her go. Then she rounded the bend and came down the farm lane and up the porch steps and set her pail on the railing and said what she said. There was one more thing she told me that I have thought about many times in the 42 years since. She said that when it first stepped out of the thimbleberry bushes, before she had time to think anything about it, before the fear arrived and before it went, she had an impression, not a thought, Not a decision that the clearing felt more complete with it in it than it had felt before it appeared, like a composition that had been one element short. She said she knew that sounded strange, and she was not sure what it meant. I was not sure either, but I wrote it down in the small journal I kept that fall, because it seemed like information, even if I could not yet say what it was information about. She told me all of it at the kitchen table, while Carl banged a wooden spoon on his high chair tray and the August light turned copper through the kitchen window. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "I don't think it wanted to hurt me, Mama. I think it was curious about me the same as I was curious about it." I asked if it could have been someone's child, someone with an unusual condition, wandering from another property. I asked carefully, because Patty did not respond well to being managed, but I needed to exhaust the practical explanations before I could sit with what she was telling me. She shook her head and said it was not a person. The brow and the nose were not in any human range. The hair was not clothing she had been close enough to see. It was the body itself. And the hands. The proportions of the hands were not human proportions, not for any size or condition of human being. I got up and called Glenn at the barn. He came up to the house and sat across from Patty at the kitchen table and listened to the whole account again from the beginning. He asked 2 questions. First, how far the brow ridge overhanged the eyes, not relative to a human, but in absolute terms. How much shadow it cast. She showed him with her hand, pressing her palm to her own forehead and holding her palm out several inches in front of it. He watched and nodded slowly. Then he asked about the walking. He wanted to know if the stride had any side-to-side motion, any bob, or whether it moved level and straight through the step. She said straight, low center of gravity, but straight. No bob at all. He nodded again and made notes in the small notebook he kept in his barn jacket. He said, "All right." He said it in the register he used when he had diagnosed a problem in the barn that he understood but was not ready to put full language to yet. "All right," meaning I hear you. "All right," meaning this needs thought. He did not go back to the barn. He stayed up at the house through the rest of the afternoon. And that evening, after Patty was in bed and Carl was down and the farm was quiet, he sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and said, "I want to go up tomorrow morning and look at the clearing." I said I figured he would. He said he wanted to look at the ground. The next morning was the kind of August morning that gives the Skagit foothills their reputation, a low gray ceiling sitting on the ridgeline. The mountains lost behind cloud, the air damp and cooler than August had any right to be. Glenn left after the morning milking, around 8, taking the logging road with the ease of a man who had been walking those hills for 7 years. Patty walked with him to show him the route, and I stayed with Carl in the morning work and the particular quality of waiting that comes when someone you trust is going somewhere to find information that is going to matter. They were gone nearly 2 hours. When they came back, Glenn was quiet in his familiar manner when what he had gathered did not fit any existing framework. He sat at the kitchen table while I poured coffee, and Patty sat across from him and waited. And he opened his notebook and read from what he had written. 8-inch prints in the soft mud at the clearing's south edge. The foot wider than a human foot in proportion across the ball, and the toe spread, all 5 toes defined. The big toe set noticeably wider from the second toe than human alignment, suggesting lateral mobility in the midfoot. The arch low and nearly flat. The pressure distribution showing weight carried slightly forward rather than through the heel. The stride between consecutive clear prints was 2.5 feet long for the height Patty had described, but consistent with a figure that had longer legs relative to its torso than a human does. Not all the prints were from yesterday. He had found older impressions partially overlapping the fresh ones. The mud in the older depressions dried to a harder consistency than the surrounding ground. The clearing had been visited before more than once, over a period of at least several days. A presence had been returning to that specific location, at that specific elevation, returning. He had also found berry leavings along the south edge canes. Stripped stems, one at a time, the berry taken, and the stem left clean and standing. Not the branch stripping of deer or elk. Not the high-reach damage of a bear. Individual berries, picked with fingers, tracking along about 8 feet of cane with a methodical attention. He picked up his coffee and looked at Patty and said, "You were right, that it was not a person." Patty said, "I know." He looked at me and said, "I do not have a name for it." I said, "Neither do I." He said, "But I want to keep paying attention." What followed in the days immediately after Patty's encounter was a period of heightened attention so constant it was almost uncomfortable. Nothing overt happened. The dairy work continued. Carl kept doing what a 14-month-old does, and the school preparations for 4th grade filled Patty's late August days. But Glenn started walking the northern boundary of the property in the evenings, a practice he had not kept for years, and I found myself pausing at the kitchen window more often than I had any practical reason to. I was looking at the tree line, specifically the section of red alder at the north edge of the yard where the mown grass gave way to the rough growth leading up toward the hillside timber. The alders were close grown, 4 to 8 inches in diameter, and they formed a visual barrier substantial enough to conceal most of what might be standing inside the first 2 trunks. I had never thought much about those alders before that week. By the 5th day, I could have drawn you their layout from memory, which 2 had the widest gap between their trunks. What angle from the kitchen window gave me the deepest view into the shadow behind them, where the ditch edge made a shallow depression in the soft ground at the yard's north boundary. On the second night after Patty's encounter, the dogs woke us. We had Rook, Glenn's border collie, and Hazel, a beagle mix who had come with the property and who we kept because she had outlasted several predictions about her constitution. Rook barked for reasons. Hazel barked for reasons that were broader and less discriminating. Between the 2 of them, their alarm covered everything from coyotes in the south pasture to mice in the feed room, and I knew every register of it as you know every register of your children's voices. What they produced at 2 in the morning on that second night was none of those registers. They went off together, which was unusual, and the sound started as barking and fell into a lower, more sustained register before it cut off completely. Both dogs stopped at the same moment, as if a switch had been thrown. Glenn got up. I heard him cross to the window. He came back after several minutes, and I asked what he saw. He said nothing in the yard. Nothing on the lane, nothing from the bedroom window. He paused. Then he said both dogs were sitting at the north edge of the yard, shoulder to shoulder, facing the alders, not barking, just sitting and looking at the tree line. He had called Rook by name, and Rook had turned to look at him, and then faced the alders again, and did not come. Rook had never once in his working life failed to come when Glenn called him. In the morning, before Glenn was out of the barn, I walked the north yard edge. The soft ground alongside the drainage ditch held what I was half expecting. 2 sets of prints, both from a figure that walked upright on 2 legs, both distinct enough in the wet soil to measure. The first set matched what Glenn had described from the clearing, 8 inches long, wide across the ball, the toes defined and spread. The second set was prints I had to crouch down and read twice before I accepted what I was looking at. 12.5 inches from heel to the front of the longest toe. The stride between consecutive impressions was close to 5 feet. Whatever had made the second set was not the juvenile. I stood at the yard edge in the early morning drizzle and looked at the alder tree line 80 feet away. 1 set of prints at 8 inches, and beside it, overlapping in one section, a second set at 12.5 inches, with a stride that put its height well above mine. 2 of them had come to the edge of our yard in the night. Only the smaller set had crossed the drainage ditch and entered the farm's mown ground. The larger prints stopped at the boundary, at the edge where the rough growth met the yard. They had come that far and then not crossed, and at some point in the small hours they had both gone back as they came. Glenn measured the prints when he came in for breakfast, the same deliberate measurement he had given the clearing. He wrote everything in his notebook sizes, stride lengths, impression depths. He wrote without comment for several minutes. Then he set the pen down and said, "The large ones stopped at the ditch boundary." I said I had noticed. He said, "They stopped there, not because they couldn't cross, because they chose not to." He meant it precisely. The larger prints had come within 30 feet of the yard fence. Nothing had stopped them from crossing the ditch and entering the yard. They had not been turned away by the fence or the yard light or the dogs. They had come to the edge of our maintained ground and held there, and then they had gone back into the timber. A thing that makes that choice is not operating on stimulus alone. We did not tell Patty about the yard prints right away. She was 9 years old and had already held a considerable amount with composure, but there was a real difference between knowing that a small, curious figure had followed her home from the berry patch and knowing that a second, considerably larger figure had stood at the edge of your yard in the night. We needed to sit with the second piece ourselves before we handed it to her. Patty found the prints anyway. She found them the morning after, before school, crouching at the drainage ditch and pressing her small hand flat beside the large impression. Her hand was 4 inches across. The print beside it was 3 times that width. She stood and looked at the tree line for a full minute. Then she came inside, washed her hands, and sat down to eat her toast with a calm that would have been striking in anyone older than she was. She said without looking up, "It came to see where I live. Well, one bring. I said I thought that was probably true. She said, "The big one came too." I said yes, she considered that. Then she said, "The big one stayed at the ditch. It stopped at the boundary." She had read the prints the same way Glenn had, in the same sequence, and arrived at the same conclusion. The decision at the boundary carried weight. She caught the bus. I stood in the kitchen with Carl on my hip and looked at the north tree line through the window, and I thought about the distinction she had drawn between scared and careful, and how much work that distinction was doing. The morning had gone on the way mornings do on a working farm: breakfast dishes, Carl's bottle. The laundry hung before the dew came back up, but underneath all of it, running quiet and constant, was the knowledge that the tree line I had been glancing at for 9 years had become a different thing in the space of a single afternoon. It was still the same row of red alder, but I was no longer certain it was empty. Over the next week, the northern boundary became a fixed point in my daily geography. My eyes went there automatically when I passed the kitchen window, when I came around the corner of the barn, when I stepped onto the porch at any hour. Most of the time there was nothing, just the close-grown alders and the alder shadow. But some mornings I would find Rook already positioned at the north yard edge, sitting and looking at the tree line with his ears slightly forward and his body at rest, not alarmed but attending. On the 4th morning after the yard prints, I found evidence at the garden edge. Not a print. The ground there was too dry. But a presence had moved through the pole beans in the night, taking beans from the upper part of the plants in a way that was not consistent with deer or rabbits. Not browsing as deer browse, not stripping whole stalks, individual beans from the upper portions of the plants that a deer would have needed to stretch for, taken with a selectiveness that I could not account for. About a third of the ripe beans from the upper reaches were gone. The lower beans, the ones a deer would take first, were untouched. I told Glenn at breakfast, and he came out and looked, and he stood in the pole bean row for a while without speaking. Then he said, "That's hand-picking. Those beans were hand-picked." He was quiet for another moment. He said, "This whole time, it was not just looking at the house. He meant that the juvenile, and we assumed it was the juvenile, based on the reach height, had not been confining its curiosity to the visual. It had been learning the farm in a broader way, touching it at the edges, not taking in a way that felt like raiding, but in a way that felt like examination. The same methodical care in the berry picking at the clearing now applied to the garden. Glenn made a point to leave the upper beans unpicked from then on. He did not explain this to me, and he did not need to. On the 6th day, there was a sound at close to 4 in the morning that woke me without waking Glenn. Not the dogs did not stir. A sound from above the farm, on the hillside, that was lower than anything I had heard from those hills, and that was sustained in a way that natural sounds do not sustain. It lasted perhaps 8 seconds, and then stopped. I lay in the dark for a long time after it stopped, listening to the ordinary sounds of the valley settling into the small hours, and I thought about Glenn's notebook with its measurements and stride lengths, and I thought about Patty in the clearing offering berries on her open palm, and I thought about the fact that whatever had made that sound had been close enough for me to feel the frequency of it in the bed frame. On the 5th evening, at 40 minutes past 7 by the kitchen clock, I looked up from the dishes and saw the figure in the gap between 2 alders, not partially visible. Standing in the gap between the 2 widest spaced alders at the north edge, facing the house, in the last of the August evening light, the dark chestnut hair, dense and close to the body, with no warmth in the color, just the deep brown-black of shaded bark. The heavy brow visible even at 60 feet because the face below it was lighter in tone, making the features readable. The wide nose, the heavy jaw, and the eyes, large and dark, pointed with full directness at my kitchen window. At me, I set down the pot I was washing. Carl hit his spoon on the floor. The radio kept on. A truck went past on the county road 200 yards south, and the figure at the tree line did not shift its attention by a degree. I stood at the window for close to a minute. Then I went to the back door and opened it and walked out onto the porch. The figure's head turned when the door opened. Not the whole body tension that precedes flight in a startled animal, just the head, at the neck, with a lateral control that reads as a person turning rather than an animal startling. It oriented toward me with the same quality of attention it had been giving the window. I stopped at the edge of the porch. 60 feet of yard between us. The garden hose coiled by the tap. The bird bath Glenn had built from river stone. The gap in the fence where the old gate post had rotted out. Ordinary things. My yard. The space I had walked across 1,000 times without thought. And at the other end of it, standing in the alder gap, a being I did not have a category for, looking at me. I put my hands where it could see them, open, at my sides. Not a gesture I had planned, just what my hands did. It looked at my hands. Then, it looked at my face. Whatever it was deciding, it took its time. I did not move. The August evening moved around us, the barn swallows working the insects overhead, the Skagit River audible somewhere below the far pasture, the first cricket beginning in the grass near the south fence. All of it completely ordinary. All of it exactly as it was on every other August evening on this farm. There is a quality to standing still in the presence of something that is also standing still and also watching you that is different from any other kind of stillness I know. A patient stillness between 2 beings, who are each the object of the other's full attention, has a texture to it, a density. The air between us felt different from the air on either side of it. I am aware that this is an imprecise description and I cannot improve on it. At some point during that minute of standing and looking, I understood that I was not the one being brave. Bravery would have required fear as its material, and the fear was not there. What I was doing was simpler than bravery. I was being present, fully and without performance, in a situation I did not have prior experience for, and I was allowing whatever was in front of me to see that presence for what it was, which was a woman standing on her back porch in the last of an August evening, hands open, looking at something she had no name for, making no claims and offering no threat and asking only to be read accurately. Whatever it read, it appeared to find sufficient. After a long moment, it made a sound. One sound, brief, from the chest rather than the throat, a frequency I felt in the air between us as much as I heard it with my ears. It was low and it went slightly up at the end, and the closest I can come to describing what it communicated is this. It was the shape of a question, not a threatening one, a genuine one. The sound of something that has arrived at a place and is establishing that it is here and you are here. And what, between the two of you, comes next? Then it stepped back. 1 step, 2. The alders closed behind it and it was gone. The tree line was just the tree line, and the evening was just the evening. I stood on the porch for a few minutes. Carl would need me shortly. The supper was not finished. The ordinary things were still waiting. I went inside and finished the dishes and got food on the stove. And when Glenn's truck came up the lane, I was at the table and I waited until after the meal and after Carl was down before I said anything. I said, "Glenn, it came to the tree line tonight. While I was at the dishes, I went out to the porch. I walking to the tree line tonight." He set his coffee mug down. He said, "And?" I said. It looked at me. It made one sound. Then it stepped back into the trees. He said, "Were you afraid?" I thought about it honestly. I said no. He nodded slowly. He said, "Patty wasn't afraid of it either." I said, "No." He said, "That's not nothing." He was right. We both knew what he meant. A thing that approaches a yard boundary with harmful intent does not produce a single brief vocalization and then step back. It does not stand at a distance and hold the position of something making an inquiry. Everything about the encounter had been legible as other than aggression, and both Glenn and I had been reading the language of large animals for long enough to know the difference. He said, "It's going to come back." I said, "I know." He said, "Then we should be on the porch when it does." That became our evening habit. After Carl was in bed and the dairy work was finished, Glenn and I would sit on the back porch without the yard light on. Some evenings nothing happened. Some evenings we would sit for an hour and hear only the usual sounds and go inside without incident. But on most evenings, somewhere between 7:40 and 8:30, Rook would stand up from where he had been lying at Glenn's feet and face north, and produce the low, sustained, almost moan sound that was his specific register for this, and then settle back down. And roughly half the time after that, we would see the figure in the gap between the alders. Each time, it held position for several minutes. Each time, it stood in the same gap, facing the house. Each time, it made no move toward the yard. And each time, when it withdrew, it did so unhurriedly, as you leave a place you have no reason to rush away from. Glenn kept his notebook through all of this. He recorded the time of arrival, the duration of each visit, the weather and wind direction. He noted that the figure came less often on cold nights when the wind pushed down from the north off the snowpack, and more often on still, warm nights. He noted that on 3 separate occasions during these visits, he heard lower, longer vocalizations from above and east in the timber, and that the figure in the alders responded briefly to these calls before returning its attention to the house. He said one evening quietly, "It's reporting in." I said, "That's what it sounds like." He said, "Something above us in the timber is waiting to hear what it finds here." I had been thinking the same. The figure at our tree line, the one I had started thinking of as the juvenile, because its size and proportions pointed to a juvenile, not adult of its kind, was operating within a relationship with others further in the mountains. The low exchanges and how the juvenile seemed more settled on the evenings when the calls from upslope came, all pointed to a family structure in which the juvenile's nightly visits were known to and permitted by someone higher in the timber. That realization landed differently than the others. The juvenile's curiosity was comprehensible. Young things investigate the new and the interesting, but a family structure that allowed the juvenile to keep coming meant the arrangement was collective. It was not operating outside its group's awareness. It was operating inside its group's sanction. Patty found out about the evening visits as children find out the things their parents have not yet decided how to tell them, which is by going directly to where the information is. About 10 days into our porch routine, at close to 9 o'clock on a Tuesday, I went to the kitchen and found the back door pushed open 2 inches with Patty's hand on the knob. She was in her nightgown, standing just inside the door, looking out through the gap at the north tree line. She had heard Rook do the sound. I came and stood beside her at the door. She pointed, with one finger, at the gap between the two alders. The juvenile was there, in its usual position, facing the house. Patty and I stood together in the open door and looked at it. Patty's hand found my arm. She said quietly, "It's the same one from the berry patch." I said, "How can you tell?" She said, "The tilt." She was right. There was a specific way the juvenile held its head, a slight forward lean, a characteristic tilt that was consistent across every visit. A habit, a quality specific to this individual that distinguished it from any other of its kind, the same way certain people carry themselves in a way you can identify from a distance. We stood in the door for about 10 minutes. The juvenile held position, looking at the house, at us in the lit frame of the open door. Then Patty pushed the door open and stepped onto the porch. The juvenile went still. Its head came up a few degrees, not tighter, not bracing to leave, more present, more alert. Patty raised her hand. Just raised it, open-palmed, visible. The juvenile looked at the raised hand. I watched its dark eyes drop from Patty's face to her hand and return to her face. Then it made the sound, the brief, low, chest-frequency vocalization I had heard the first evening, but this time the inflection was different, shorter, steadier. The pitch, not questioning but acknowledging. Patty said, "One word." Quietly. The juvenile looked at her for a moment longer. Then it stepped back into the alders and was gone. The porch evenings became a three-person habit. Patty would come out somewhere around 7:30, sit on the top porch step with her knees pulled up, and wait. Glenn and I would be on the bench. The juvenile would appear in the alders. Patty would sit and talk quietly, narrating her days as she narrated to dogs she did not want to startle. The low, continuous voice of someone who understands that tone matters more than content when the listener is still deciding about you. The juvenile would stand in the gap and look at her and sometimes make a sound or two. And then it would withdraw. The first time it crossed the yard was the 12th day of this pattern. Patty had brought a bowl of huckleberries she had picked that afternoon from the lower slope. She set the bowl on the second porch step and backed up to sit on the railing, leaving the step and the bowl between herself and the yard. When the juvenile appeared in the alders, she did not wave or speak. It stood in the gap and looked at her, and then it looked at the bowl, and the wide nostrils went through their thorough work on the air. Then it started across the yard. Glenn put his hand over mine on the chair arm. I kept still. The juvenile moved across the open yard with the care it moved through everything, one step at a time, weight balanced and fluid, reading the ground, reading unfamiliar ground when you are not certain of the footing. It came halfway across and stopped. It looked at Patty. She sat on the railing and looked back. They held that distance for a long moment. Then it came the rest of the distance, and it stood at the base of the porch steps, 3 feet from the bowl, and it looked at Patty for a moment longer. Then it sat down in the grass, not stood looking down at the bowl. Sat, cross-legged in the yard grass, the same posture it had held in the huckleberry clearing on the day Patty first saw it. It reached forward and picked up the bowl with both hands. The hands were visible properly now, in a way they had not been at 60 feet. Wide palms, fingers longer in proportion than human fingers, the knuckles heavy, the nails thick and very dark. The bowl was a standard ceramic mixing bowl, about 10 inches across. Those hands went nearly all the way around it without any reaching. It held the bowl with a delicacy that registered as knowledge, knowing the material, knowing how much pressure was enough, stopping there. It tilted the bowl and looked at the berries and put its nose over the rim, and the nostrils did their careful work, and then it started eating, one at a time. Not scooping, not upending the bowl, picking out berries individually with the fingertips, with a precision that required real attention. Patty sat on the railing and watched it and said quietly to herself, "Those are the ones from up by the granite shelf. They're riper than the ones on the lower slope, because that section gets full afternoon sun. Between berries, the juvenile made a brief sound. Patty said, "You're welcome." When the bowl was empty, the juvenile stood and held it out toward Patty. She came off the railing and stepped down to the second step and took the bowl from those wide hands, and for a moment the bowl was transferring between them in the dim yard light. The bowl changed hands, and Patty took it and said, the juvenile looked at her for a moment longer. Then it made a sequence of sounds, 3 or 4, varying in pitch and length, connected in a pattern that had the rhythm of a sentence in some language neither of us spoke. The tone was mild and unhurried, the register of a remark you make before leaving a good conversation. Then it turned and walked back across the yard and into the alders and was gone. We sat on the porch for a while after it left. Glenn exhaled slowly. Patty came and leaned against his arm, and he put his arm around her, and we all looked at the place in the yard grass where the juvenile had been sitting. Eventually, Glenn said, "It understood what the bowl was before it crossed the yard." Patty said, "It was deciding whether to accept it, not figuring out what it was." He said, "How do you know that?" She said, "Because it waited until it had decided. Confused things investigate. It was not confused. It was considering." Glenn looked at me over her head. I looked back at him. Our daughter was 9.5 years old, and she was describing the reasoning process of a being that no scientific institution officially acknowledged as existing, and she was doing it with the matter-of-fact precision of someone reporting on a thing they had observed. I said that from the following evening we would not bring food to the porch anymore. Patty looked at me. I explained. It was not coming for the berries. The berries had been an offer, and it had accepted an offer, but it kept coming when there were no berries. If the coming became tied to food rather than contact, we would lose information about what the coming actually was. And if we stopped having food, that would tell us whether it was mostly about the food. She said, "It wasn't mostly about the food." I said, "Then stopping the food will not stop the visits, and we will know something we need to know." She nodded with the nod she gave when the logic satisfied her, even if the conclusion was inconvenient. She said, "That's right. That's right." The visits continued, regular and consistent. The juvenile coming across the yard on the evenings. Patty was on the steps, sitting in the same spot in the grass, accepting whatever conversation she was conducting with it, the one-sided narration of a 9-year-old's days, the small concerns and observations that filled her after-school hours. It listened with its head at the characteristic tilt and its dark eyes steady. And sometimes it made a sound or two, and sometimes it just sat, and at the end of every visit it rose and walked back to the alders, and the tree line took it. The exchanges themselves changed over the course of those October evenings, in ways that were subtle but that both Patty and Glenn and I tracked without conferring about it until later. In the first week, the juvenile's visits had the quality of reconnaissance. It came, it observed, it withdrew. By the second week, the quality had shifted toward a more reciprocal quality. It was not just watching Patty, it was responding to her. When she changed her topic, its body language shifted. When she laughed at something she was recounting from school, the juvenile leaned forward slightly. When she described something difficult, a conflict with a girl in her class, the frustration of a math concept that was not clicking, yet the juvenile went still in a different way, a watchful stillness rather than the relaxed stillness it held when she was light. Patty noticed all of this and narrated it to me later. In the kitchen after the porch evenings, in the same careful way she narrated everything. She said it was learning her, not learning a language or building a vocabulary of her words, but building a picture of what the different qualities of her voice meant, of what the different registers of her affect indicated about her internal state. She said it was paying attention to her, as she paid attention to the cattle when she helped Glenn in the barn, not interpreting language but reading the animal, reading the 1,000 small signals that living things send out constantly about what they are experiencing. She said, "It knows when I'm happy and when I'm not. It knows when I'm telling it something true and when I'm just filling the air. I don't know how it knows, but it knows." I said, "How do you know it knows?" She said, "Because it responds differently. When I'm telling it a genuine thing, it comes forward. When I'm just talking for the sake of talking, it stays where it is and waits for me to say something that matters." 1. Glenn was in the room for this conversation, and he said nothing. But the next morning, when I came down to make breakfast, the notebook was open on the kitchen table, and there was a new entry from late the previous night. He had written, "P reports that the juvenile can distinguish authentic communication from social filler, responds with approach behavior to genuine content, waits through performative speech. This is a high-order social cognition behavior. Consider implications." I put the coffee on and I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the north tree line in the early morning dark, and I thought about the implications Glenn had asked himself to consider. The gift bundle appeared on the 7th of October. Patty found it on the bottom porch step in the morning, before school. Not left by the juvenile, she knew the juvenile's way of leaving things, which was casual. An item dropped rather than placed. This was placed, a length of bracken fern stems, dried and still faintly green at the joint, tied together with a thin strip of cedar inner bark that had been split and wound into a cord. Not a bow knot, not a slip knot, a flat, secure wrap, the cord threaded under itself and then over and then under again until it held without slipping. A mind had considered the bundle before tying it and had tied it to hold. Glenn examined the cord work for a long time. He said, "That is tied." I said I knew. He said, "You do not tie things unless you have decided they are worth tying." The thinking that took us several days was the same on both sides of the kitchen table. The figure that had come to our yard and the figure behind it in the alders were not operating on instinct. We had known this from the first evening, from the prints and from the first porch encounter and from every subsequent visit, but the bundle was different. The bundle was made. A being had gathered the plant material and split the cedar bark and worked the fiber into cord and used that cord to bind the bundle in a way that would hold. It was manufactured for the purpose of giving it to someone. And that someone was us. The question of what it meant to receive a gift from a family of beings in the mountains above your farm did not have an answer inside any framework we had been given for understanding the world. But it had a feeling, and the feeling was not alarm. It was the feeling you have when someone you have been watching carefully, trying to understand, watching figure you out in return, finally makes a move that is unmistakably directed at you. On the morning of October 3rd, I was doing the dishes at the kitchen window when I saw two figures at the north tree line. The small one I knew now, as you know, any individual you have been watching daily for weeks by the specific quality of its posture, the particular forward tilt of its head, the proportions of its shape that were already familiar enough to identify from across a yard in failing light. The juvenile was in the alder's gap in its usual position, facing the house. The second figure was behind it and to the left, partially inside the tree line. This figure's head was above the level of my kitchen window. Standing on flat ground inside the alders, its head cleared my first-floor windowsill. That put it at a minimum of 7 feet, and the shoulders visible above and to either side of the juvenile's head were a width. I had no adequate prior experience to compare to any living thing I had seen outside of photographs. It was looking at the house, not with the juvenile's quality of concentrated curiosity, with the settled, measuring attention of something that has been assessing a situation for a long time and is confirming conclusions rather than forming them. Glenn came up behind me at the window. I heard him set his coffee mug down on the counter. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Then Glenn said, in a voice he kept very even, "She's been here the whole time." She had been here from the beginning, watching us watch her young one. Every evening that the juvenile stood in the alder's gap, every evening that it crossed the yard and sat in the grass and ate berries from a bowl, every evening that Patty sat on the porch step and talked and the juvenile listened, the large figure, the mother, because that was what every instinct and every observation pointed to, had been somewhere behind the tree line for all of it, watching us, learning what we were, running whatever calculation a mother runs when her young one keeps returning to a place she has not forbidden. And today she had come to the gap herself. I have thought many times about what it would cost in the economy of a being like the mother, with the intelligence the evidence suggested she possessed, and the experience of the human world that her caution implied, to step into a gap in the alders and be seen. She did not need to be seen. She had been managing the invisible perfectly well for the entire duration of the juvenile's visits. The juvenile had been crossing our yard for weeks, and the mother's existence had not been confirmed to us by anything more than 2 sets of prints in the mud at the yard edge. She could have continued that indefinitely. She had not continued it. She had chosen this morning to stand in the gap and let the kitchen window tell us she was there. The choosing matters. It is the part of what happened that October morning that I am least able to reduce to any simpler explanation. She had information we did not have. She knew what we did not know. Specifically that she was there and had always been there. And she shared that information. On her schedule, on her terms, in a manner she controlled completely. Not because anything compelled her. Because she had decided to. That is not the behavior of a being responding to stimulus. That is the behavior of a being with a theory of other minds. A being that understood we did not know she was there, and understood what would change for us when we did know, and made a calculation about whether that change served the situation. That calculation is what the morning cost her. And she made it anyway. Glenn said quietly. "Go to the porch." I said, "I know." I went to the back door and opened it and stepped out into the October morning. The air was cold and the valley was gray under low cloud and the mountains were invisible behind them, which is what October does in the Skagit foothills. It takes the mountains away and gives you back the sky in exchange, a trade most people do not think is fair. The yard was damp, the grass still holding last night's dew, the garden beds going ragged with the first frost damage. Both figures at the tree line went still when I appeared on the porch. The juvenile did its characteristic head tilt. The mother held position and looked at me with a steadiness that had nothing tentative in it. I could see her more clearly than the window glass had allowed. The hair was near black, not the dark chestnut of the juveniles, but a deeper tone that approached black in the overcast morning light, with threading through the shoulders and upper arms that was distinctly grayed. The dark gray of something that had been dark brown for a long time and was beginning to change. Not white, not silver as human hair goes. Dark gray threaded through the near black in a way that spoke of age without speaking of any reduction in the physical presence it inhabited. The frame was large, very large. The shoulders were a width I had no adequate reference for in any living thing I had encountered outside of photographs in textbooks. But there was a quality to how the weight settled through the hips and chest that registered as female, the same way a dairy cow's weight settles differently from a bull's. Not softness, nothing diminished, just the specific architecture of a female body at enormous scale. The chest narrowed through the rib cage in a proportion different from how a male would carry the same mass. The face was visible because of the same contrast that made all their faces readable from distance, the lighter skin tone beneath the hair, creating enough difference to let the features read. A brow more developed than the juvenile's, deeper set, overhanging the eyes further. A nose broader and flatter, the jaw heavier and more pronounced, the muscles along it carrying a thickness that spoke of real, sustained use in a way human jaw muscles no longer do. And the eyes, large and dark, set back under that brow with the same quality of aware attention the juveniles held, but without the quality of curiosity that made the juveniles look so young. These were eyes that had been in these mountains for a very long time. They did not need to figure out what they were looking at. They already knew. She held position for 2 full minutes. I did not move. Behind me through the open door, Carl began making his wake-up sounds. The morning held still. Then the mother made a sound. Not the brief questioning vocalization the juvenile used. This was longer, fuller, beginning below what I could properly hear and rising up into something audible, a tone that moved through the October air with a quality of weight, a frequency that resonated in my sternum rather than arriving clean in my ears. It lasted 3 seconds. It was not a question. I had no answer available in any frequency that would carry meaning back across what lay between us. So I did the only thing I could. I stood still, kept my hands open at my sides, let her look at me and looked back at her, and did not flinch or drop my eyes. After the sound faded, she held position another moment. Then she turned and moved into the alders, and the juvenile moved with her, and the tree line was just the tree line again. Glenn was at the door when I came back inside. He looked at my face and said, "Tell me, have the pard?" I sat at the kitchen table and told him everything, the proportions, the grayed shoulders, the sound. He listened, and when I finished, he said, "She came today, to be seen." I said, "Yes." He said, "She had been here before. She chose today to let us know she was here." Mediastat, biastat, mediastat. I thought about what that choosing cost. You do not reveal yourself unless the circumstances have changed, or unless you have watched long enough to arrive at a decision you could not have arrived at sooner. She had watched the juvenile come to our yard for weeks, and she had watched Glenn and me on the porch, and she had watched Patty on the porch steps, and she had watched the bowl of berries change hands, and she had watched Rook stop at the half-alarm and settle back to his place. At some point in all that watching, she had moved from assessing to deciding, and the decision was that the farm's people knew what they were doing, that the trust the juvenile had extended was not misplaced, and she had come to the tree line to let us know she had decided. Glenn went back to the barn. Carl needed breakfast. The morning kept its shape around the new fact we were holding, that what lived in our timber was not just a young, curious thing acting alone, but a family with a mother who watched and thought and chose, and who had watched and thought and chosen us. I called Patty from her friend's house down the road and told her to come home. She was there in 11 minutes. I told her about the second figure, about the size of it, and the grayed hair at the shoulders, and the sound it had made. I told her I believed it was the mother of the juvenile, and that it had been in the timber behind the juvenile's visits from the start. Patty listened, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The baby has a mama." She had started calling the juvenile the baby sometime in September. Not quite accurate, the juvenile was clearly past infancy in whatever developmental terms applied to its kind, but the word had stuck. Baby meaning the young one. Baby meaning the small one. Baby meaning the one who had sat beside her in a mountain clearing and eaten berries from her palm and then followed her home. She said, "The mama let it come here. That means the mama decided we were all right." I said, "That is what I think." She said, "So, we were being evaluated the whole time." I said, "I think we were, and I think we passed." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "We should try to do that back. Look at them as they've been looking at us. Not to prove anything, just to understand." She was 9 years old, and she was describing the only reasonable approach to what we were managing: careful, reciprocal attention, conducted without pressure across a boundary neither side of it was trying to breach. The visits continued through October, and the juvenile came to the yard on most evenings when Patty was on the steps. On some evenings, the mother was visible in the alders behind the juvenile, standing well back from the gap, present but not at the tree line's edge. On these evenings, the juvenile crossed to the yard more readily, more quickly. The mother's presence behind it seemed to function as clearance, knowing that the larger figure was close by allowed the smaller one to move forward without the longer hesitation it showed on evenings when no other figure was visible in the timber. The dynamic between them was readable even from the porch bench. Not reading language, but reading relationship from the pattern of who looks at whom and when, from what happens in the moment before a decision is made. The juvenile looked to the mother before it crossed, not always overtly, not in a way obvious to anyone not watching carefully. But the glance was there, and the crossing came after it. Glenn kept his notebook through all of this. He had come to think of the record as important in a way he could not articulate precisely. He said to me one evening that whatever they were, they deserved to be observed carefully. And careful observation required documentation. And documentation required honesty about what you actually saw rather than what you thought you were seeing. Toward the end of October, on a cold, clear evening with the first hard frost in the morning, Glenn went up to the logging road gate for his evening boundary walk. He came back later than usual and sat at the kitchen table with his jacket still on. He said, "I think there are at least 4 of them, maybe more." He had stood very still at the logging road gate for 20 minutes, listening to the vocalizations coming from the timber above, the mother's frequency, which he could now identify with confidence, the juvenile's shorter, higher calls, and 2 additional voices, lower than the juvenile but distinct from each other in pitch and register, coming from 2 separate points in the timber above and to the east, 4 distinguishable frequencies at minimum, possibly a 5th that was less clear. He said, "The mother and the small one are the 2 who came forward. The others stayed in the deep timber." I said, "Why those 2? He turned his coffee mug slowly on the table. He said, "Maybe the young one is the one most inclined to investigate, and she follows it because she will not let it go alone. Or maybe the young one is specifically hers. The others have their own." The second explanation was the one I held on to. If the group had more than 1 adult, more than 1 juvenile, the particular bond between the mother at the tree line and the small figure that came to our yard was a bond specific, not maternal responsibility in general, but the relationship between one mother and the young one she was watching. They had come to us as a pair. The decision about who would approach and who would stay back had been made collectively by a group with enough social complexity to make such distinctions. The gift on the bark piece appeared on the morning of the 18th of October. Patty found it before school. On the bottom porch step, not from the juvenile left things casually. An item dropped rather than arranged. This was arranged with a specificity that was immediately readable as intention. A flat section of stripped alder bark, smooth on its inner surface, roughly 10 inches by 6. On it, 3 items placed with care. A cluster of late thimbleberries, plump and ripe, still fresh enough that they had been picked within the last few hours, picked after the night's frost had softened them to their peak. A piece of root, dark and gnarled, that I spent the better part of the day identifying with the help of a plant guide from the Cedro Woolly Library as Asarum caudatum, wild ginger, which grows on the shaded forest floor across the Pacific Northwest, and has been used for generations by people who knew these forests as a gentle digestive remedy and mild analgesic, and a salmon vertebra, white and very clean. Old enough that every trace of its original smell had been replaced by the smell of dry soil and stone, kept for a long time, found or held, and kept. I brought the bark piece inside and set it on the kitchen table and looked at the 3 items in their arrangement and tried to read what the arrangement said. Glenn came in and stood over it as he stood over something in the barn that he needed to understand before handling it. He said, "The berries are practical, fresh food." He looked at the root. "The ginger root is practical, medicine, if you know what it is." He looked at the vertebra. "But that one is not practical. That has been kept." He picked up the vertebra carefully. It was old enough to be light, the calcium releasing slowly over years, the bone becoming midway between bone and mineral. He turned it in his fingers and then set it back on the bark piece with the same care he had used to pick it up. He said, "Something found this and kept it, and now it is being given to us." Patty touched the vertebra and then the ginger root and then the berries, in sequence, and looked at me. She said, "She's introducing herself." I said I thought that was as close to a translation as we were going to get. Glenn set the bark piece on the kitchen windowsill where it stayed for the rest of our time on that farm. It is in a box in my closet now, 18 years after we sold the property. The berries have been gone for 40 years. The ginger root has dried to a hard, dark knot. The vertebra is lighter than it was, the calcium releasing slowly the way bone does when it is no longer protected by the body that made it. They are not proof of anything, and were never intended to be. They are the physical remainder of a gesture made by a being toward another being across a distance that neither of them could measure in units they shared. November came as it comes in the Skagit foothills, not with drama but with a slow, steady dampening. The deciduous trees going gold and then losing their gold in a week of rain, the mornings finding their darkness faster and faster. The dairy rhythm shifted toward winter weights, and the farm took on the heavier, more interior quality of the colder months. The visits continued through November, though at reduced frequency. The juvenile came 4 or 5 times a week, where it had been coming close to every evening in October. Glenn interpreted this as seasonal movement. The food sources at higher elevations were going fast as the nights frosted hard, and a group that ranged widely would be following availability up and down the mountain. There were probably days when they were miles from us, tracking whatever their November circuit required, but when the juvenile came, the connection with Patty was unchanged. It crossed the yard when she was on the steps. It sat in the grass and listened to whatever she was narrating that evening, making its brief sounds, and the exchange built on itself as exchanges between attentive beings build not through translation but through the accumulation of time spent in each other's company without harm. On one evening in mid-November, the mother stepped a full yard out of the alders. Not into the yard, still well inside the tree line, still within the shadow of the alder trunks, but 1 full yard further from the deep timber than she had positioned herself on any previous night, standing in a band of open air between the close-grown trees and the yard edge, visible fully rather than partially. The juvenile was in the yard at the porch steps. Patty was on the top step. Glenn and I were on the bench, and the mother stood 1 yard out from the alder line and looked at all 4 of us, moving her attention from the juvenile to Patty to Glenn to me and back again, the same lateral, neck-only movement that all of them used. Glenn lifted his hand. Slowly, just raised it open at his side. She looked at his raised hand. She looked at his face. She made no sound, but she stayed in that more exposed position for 3 minutes. And then she moved back into the timber with the unhurried pace of something withdrawing on its own terms. Not retreating. Withdrawing. There is a difference, Glenn said afterward. She's getting comfortable, I said. Or she has decided to get comfortable, he said. I thought about that. For us, in the frameworks we used for understanding behavior, the distinction between a state arriving involuntarily and a state being chosen mattered enormously. I was not sure it mattered the same way in the economy of what the mother was doing. She watched. She assessed. She moved. The assessment and the movement were part of the same continuous process, not a before and after. It was comfortable to call it a choice, and I think it was a choice. But it was the kind of choice that a being with sufficient intelligence makes so continuously and so fluently that the deliberation is invisible in the outcome, the same way an experienced carpenter's choice to angle the cut a certain way is visible only in the result. The November that followed Roy's visit was the quietest month of the whole experience. The juvenile came in frequently twice the first week, once the second, twice more in the final weeks of November. On the evenings it came, it no longer crossed to the yard. It stood in the alder's gap and looked toward the house, and after a few minutes it went back. Patty sat on the porch steps on these evenings and looked back. And sometimes she talked and sometimes she did not, and the juvenile received whatever she offered with the same patient attention it had always brought to their meetings. Glenn said once, watching Patty on the steps, and the juvenile in the gap, that it reminded him of how a relationship changes after a pattern has been established, after the period of first contact and increasing trust has done its work and settled into a more sustainable state, less fraught, less in need of demonstration. He said it reminded him of how his relationship with the land itself had changed between the first year on this farm and the 7th. In the first year, everything required conscious attention. Nothing could be taken for granted. Every decision was deliberate. By the 7th year, the relationship had become part of the furniture of daily life, a thing carried rather than managed. He said, "I think we've become part of its world, not as something to investigate, but as something that exists." I said, "Is that good?" He said, "I think it might be the best outcome there is." I thought about that for a long time afterward. The best outcome was not full contact, not established communication, not any form of recognized relationship. The best outcome was simply to have been incorporated, quietly and without drama, into the geography of a family's daily experience. To be a known element of the territory, to exist in their world as the granite outcropping at the berry patch existed, not threatening, not useful, just there. A feature of the landscape, a known thing, assessed and found stable. We had passed from the category of unknown thing to the category of known thing. And for a family of beings whose survival depended on keeping unknown things at a safe distance, being moved into the known category was the closest they could come to extending trust. The crisis came in the first week of December, in the person of Roy Barnes. Roy ran the beef operation 2 miles north on the county road, on the slightly higher ground, where the valley floor began tilting toward the mountain slope. He was 54 that year, compact and sharp-featured, with the watching quality of a man who had learned over a lifetime that the world contained more things requiring accounting for than most people tracked. He was not unfriendly. He followed things to their conclusions, and he believed in the accountability of the official record. He reported the irrigation board about ditch maintenance when maintenance was needed. He reported the county about road weights when the numbers warranted it. He was a man who believed that unusual things should go through the appropriate channels. He drove up our lane that Saturday morning and sat in his truck for a moment before getting out. That pause told me a great deal. Roy did not pause. I brought him inside and poured coffee, and he sat at the kitchen table and made 3 minutes of small talk about November hay prices before he said what he had come to say. He said, "I have been seeing something at my north fence line for the past 6 weeks. Evening times mostly. I want to know if you have had anything similar over here." I kept my face even. I said, "What kind of something?" He said, "Big. Walking upright. Not a bear. I know what a bear looks like, standing and walking, and this is not that. Too big for any person I have ever seen. Moving in a way a bear does not move when it is on 2 legs." He looked at me steadily across his coffee mug. I called the game department. The man I talked to told me it was probably a black bear getting a better view and that bears do that sometimes. He paused. "I have hunted these hills for 30 years. I know what a standing bear looks like." The man on the phone knew I knew, and he gave me that answer anyway. I asked when he had first seen it. He said the first week of October. He said he had seen it, or sign of it, prints along the fence line, his cattle going strangely quiet rather than showing the usual nervous agitation they showed with predators, a sense of being watched from the timber that he had learned not to dismiss over his years on that property 11 times between early October and now. He said his wife had seen it once from the upstairs window at dusk, at his north tree line, and had come down the stairs white-faced and not willing to describe it in detail. He said he had gotten his rifle out one night, had it at his shoulder with the scope on the tree line, trying to get a better look. Whatever it was had come out far enough for him to see the face through the scope. He had put the rifle down. I said, "What made you put it down? What made you put it down?" He looked at the window. Then he said, "It looked back at me, like it knew what I was doing." like it had an opinion about it. He put his hands flat on the table. He said, "I want to know what we're dealing with." Roy Barnes was not going to be satisfied with vague reassurances. He had come here because the official channel had given him an answer he knew was not the answer, and because we were the nearest neighbors and most likely to have information. If I told him I did not know what he was seeing, he would keep looking for someone who would tell him, and the kind of people who gave definitive answers about things in the mountains above the Skagit Valley tended to arrive with equipment and personnel and a process I could not predict the outcome of. I made the decision in the time it took him to take his next sip of coffee. I said, "Roy, I need you to trust me on something." He looked at me. I said, "I have seen it too, more than once, and I have had enough time to watch it close to tell you it is not a danger. It has not threatened anyone on this farm or acted with any aggression toward any person or animal here, and I am asking you to leave it where it is." He said, "What is it?" I said, "Something that has more right to those mountains than either of us does." He was quiet for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. Carl was in his playpen behind me. Roy Barnes turned his coffee mug slowly on the table with both hands, and I watched his face doing the work that a decent man's face does when he is deciding between what his framework tells him to do and what his instinct is telling him. Roy Barnes was not a man given to following instinct over procedure, but his instinct and his procedure had already diverged when he lowered his rifle from his shoulder. The face in his scope had produced an effect that rifle protocol did not account for, and he had put the rifle down. He had already made one decision outside his framework. I was asking him to make another. He said, "Is it dangerous?" I said no. He said, "To kids?" I said, "My daughter has been closer to it than I have. I allowed that because I have watched how it behaves close up, and it does not behave like a threat, not to anyone." He looked at me for a long time. He said, "My wife is going to want to know what I decided and why." I said, "Tell her a neighbor you trust asked you to let it be." He held my eyes for another moment. Then he nodded. Once, he put his mug in the sink, an experience he had never done in any previous visit to our kitchen, and went out to his truck and drove north toward his own property. Glenn came in for his mid-morning break and found me at the table, and I told him about Roy. He sat and listened, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He'll hold." I said, "I think so too." He said, "But Roy is not the only one seeing it. If it is at his fence line and at ours, it is ranging further than just our timber." He was right. Every point the juvenile touched at the human margin was a potential exposure. Roy had held his word, but there would be other people on other properties, and not all of them would come to us first, and not all of them would be willing to be persuaded. The game department came 3 weeks after Roy's visit. A man named Earl Cooper, about 30 years old, with the manner of someone who had been given an assignment he had mixed feelings about, and had decided to do it professionally regardless. He came to our farm because we were the nearest occupied property to the area where 2 reports had been filed independently, one from a couple renting a cabin on the North Fork Road for a hunting weekend, one from a Forest Service trail crew doing survey work on the ridge above our east pasture. Earl Cooper sat at our kitchen table and asked questions in a sequence designed to catch inconsistency. Glenn and I had talked through our answers the night before. We said we had not observed anything unusual. Earl Cooper said the cattle in our north pasture bordered the timber, and that livestock tended to show stress behavior when a large predator was working the area. He asked about fence testing, clustering, restlessness in the herd. Glenn said the cattle had been unsettled some evenings in September, which he had attributed to a cougar that had been in the area. He said the behavior had resolved by October. He said the herd had been fine since. Earl Cooper wrote in his notebook. He asked about tracks. We said no. He said the reports described something approximately 8 feet tall, bipedal, moving through timber at dusk. He said the game department's official classification was probable bear misidentification, but that the volume of reports from this drainage over several decades had been noted in their internal files. He said that last part in a tone that carried a different weight from the rest of what he said. Not the tone of the official answer. The tone of a statement that acknowledged, without stating it, that the official answer and the internal note were not the same thing. Glenn said, "What happens when something is not a misidentification?" Earl Cooper looked at Glenn. He said, "That's above my pay grade." He closed his notebook, thanked us for our time, and drove down the lane. Glenn and I stood at the kitchen window and watched him go. Glenn said quietly, "Someone above his pay grade has thought about this." I said, "Yes." He said, "If they come back with camera traps and a systematic survey of that drainage, it is over for whatever is up there." A survey meant grid coverage, plaster casts of any tracks, camera documentation over weeks or months, the kind of patient, systematic documentation that would not miss what was in those mountains if it was still coming to the forest edges. And if it did not miss, the question of what to do about what it found would go to levels above Earl Cooper, and then above that, and at some point the answer would involve people and equipment and a process none of us would be able to stop or redirect. We sat with that through the rest of the day. Glenn went through the afternoon milking and I went through Carl's afternoon, and we did not talk about it directly. But both of us were running the same calculation: what happened if nothing changed, and whether we could live with the outcome. After Carl was down and the house was quiet, Glenn sat at the kitchen table with his notebook and his rough sketch of the property and the drainage above it. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "They need to move higher. They need to move higher." I said, "I know." He said, "The lower range, the berry patch elevation, the logging road drainage, the north pasture tree line that is where all the contact has been happening. If they range higher, into the national forest above 4,000 feet, the terrain gets too rugged for a systematic survey to cover effectively. The drainage up there branches into 6 or 7 separate creek systems. You would need months." I said, "We cannot move them." He said, "No, but we can stop being what is pulling them down." That was the conversation. The juvenile kept returning because of Patty. The mother followed the juvenile. The family's presence at the lower margin was anchored, in part, by a connection that had started in a mountain clearing between a child who offered berries and a young being who accepted them. If Patty stopped being at the yard's edge in the evenings, if the porch routine stopped, if the presence that had made our farm a fixed point in the juvenile circuit was removed, there was no guarantee the family would move higher. But there was the possibility. We could not choose for them. We could only change what we offered. The weeks between Earl Cooper's visit and the decision to stop the porch evenings were the hardest weeks of the whole 7 months. Not because of fear, and not because of anything the family in the timber did. They continued on their pattern. The juvenile visiting when the weather allowed, the mother occasionally visible in the alders behind it. The hardness came from the particular pressure of knowing that a good thing was going to have to end, and not yet having found the words to begin the ending. Glenn and I did not argue about it. We had been married 9 years, and we had settled into a way of working through disagreements that mostly consisted of sitting with the problem from different angles and waiting for the angles to converge. We both knew what needed to happen. We both knew we did not want it to happen. Those two things sat at the kitchen table with us for about 10 days and took up a considerable amount of the air. Carl was the accidental grace of that period. He was 18 months old by then and had reached the stage of development where he was deeply interested in everything and capable of sustained attention to nothing, and the requirement of keeping track of him while he toured the farm with his wobbly-legged determination was a constant demand on our attention that left less space for the carrying of difficult things. He had discovered the cats in the barn and was convinced, each time we took him out there, that this would be the time one of them would allow itself to be caught. He had also discovered what happened to the garden hose when you squeezed the nozzle with both hands, which had produced one memorable afternoon in the garden and a change in the location of the hose storage. He was vivid and present and enormously funny in the manner toddlers are funny. And Glenn and I needed both the distraction and the laughter during those 10 days. On the evening before we talked to Patty, Glenn and I sat on the porch alone after Carl was down, without the yard light, in the cold November dark. The juvenile had not come that evening. Rook had produced his half-alarm once, early, and then had settled. The mountains were out to the east under a clear sky, the first stars visible over the high ridge, and the valley below us was quiet with the particular quality of quiet that descends on a working farm after the last of the day's tasks have been completed and the animals are settled and there is nothing left to do but be. Glenn said, "I want to make sure we are doing this for the right reason." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I want to make sure we are doing this to protect them, not because we are afraid of what Earl Cooper's survey would find, not because we are uncomfortable with the attention, not because any part of us would prefer a simpler life. I want to make sure we are asking Patty to give this up because it is the best thing for the family in that timber, and not for any lesser reason." I thought about that for a long time. Then I said, "I think those reasons all point the same direction." He said, "Yes, but they do not all have the same weight, and Patty deserves to know which one is doing the most work." He was right, and we talked to Patty with that clarity the following evening, and she listened with that clarity, and when she said she needed to tell it, she meant she needed to tell the juvenile the real reason, not a softened version of it. She had enough respect for what had built between them to give it the honest truth of why it had to stop. It took us 3 days to tell Patty. She sat at the kitchen table and listened to us explain the game department visit, Earl Cooper's notebook, the risk a systematic survey would pose to a family that was generating sightings at multiple properties, the fact that our evenings on the porch were one of the things anchoring the juvenile to the low margin of its range. She listened without interrupting, hands flat on the table, looking from Glenn's face to mine with the specific attention she gave to information she was going to have to act on. When we finished, she said, "I need to tell it." I said, "We do not know how much of what you say it understands." She said, I don't think it understands the words, but it can read what I'm feeling. If I can make it understand that something has changed, that there is a reason things have to be different, I think it will understand enough." Glenn said, "How?" She said, "The same way it has been talking to me, not in words, in what the body says." She was describing a genuine thing. She had spent 2 months in close daily observation of the juvenile, learning to read it without language, and it had been learning to read her the same way. The literacy they had built was not linguistic. It was somatic, the information that bodies carry in their posture, their pace, their gesture. She was not wrong that she could use it to tell a truth, as it had been telling her truths about itself for weeks. Glenn and I agreed. The next evening, Patty went to the porch steps alone. We stayed at the back door, just inside it, with the door open. The juvenile appeared in the alder's gap and saw Patty on the steps and started across the yard. Patty did not smile. She sat on the top step with her hands on her knees, and she waited until the juvenile had crossed the yard and settled in its spot in the grass. And then she sat quietly for a long moment. She did not narrate. She did not make any of the easy conversation that had been the texture of every previous meeting. The juvenile looked at her. It waited as it always waited when she paused, patient, attending. Then Patty stood. She took 1 step back toward the door, not quickly, not urgently, just 1 step back. She raised one hand, not toward the juvenile, but toward the tree line, toward the hills rising east in the dark, and she shook her head, slowly. Once, the juvenile went completely still. Patty did it again. 1 step back, hand raised toward the hills, head shake. The juvenile looked at her hand, at her face, at her hand again. Then it made a sound. It was longer than any of its usual sounds, and it dropped at the end rather than rising. And it landed in my chest differently from anything I had heard from it before. Not pain, not anger. An older and quieter register than both the sound a young being makes when it understands that a good thing is ending and the ending is outside anyone's control. Patty's eyes went bright. She blinked twice and held the brightness back, and she said, very quietly, "I know. I'm sorry." The juvenile sat in the grass for another moment. Then it stood. At the tree line, it stopped and looked back at her. She raised her hand, not a wave, just raised it. Open, held there. And the juvenile looked at her raised hand for a long moment. Then it went into the alders. From deeper in the timber, moving away from us and upslope, we heard the mother's low, sustained frequency rise briefly and then fade into the dark timber toward the upper drainage. That was the last evening the juvenile crossed the yard. We saw them twice more. The first time was in February. Glenn had gone to the logging road gate on a cold, clear morning to check a water line. He saw them on the ridge above the farm, moving east through the timber on the south-facing slope where the snow had cleared enough to let them travel. Two figures, the mother and the juvenile, both identifiable at the distance, the size differential between them, the particular way each moved, the pace they held together crossing the open slope. They were heading east, toward the upper drainage, toward the national forest land above 4,000 feet. Neither of them looked toward the farm. Glenn stood at the gate and watched until the timber took them. He came home and said the juvenile's pace had a directedness that knew where it was going. He said the mother moved beside it, her long stride eating ground without any apparent effort, and the two of them crossed the open slope and entered the timber and were gone. The second time was March, a Tuesday afternoon, light rain, the valley low under gray cloud. I was in the kitchen and caught movement at the north alders and went to the window. The mother was at the tree line. Alone, she stood in the gap where the juvenile had always stood, and she looked at the house with the settled attention I had come to know, not assessing, not watchful as she had been in October. Looking as you look at a place you have a relationship with. I went to the back door. I opened it and stepped out onto the porch. The March rain came down on my face, light and cold. The mountains were invisible. The farm was quiet. The mother looked at me. I thought about the bark piece on the kitchen windowsill with its 3 items, about the cord-tied bundle of fern stems, about the salmon vertebra older than anything else in our house, about a bowl of huckleberries changing hands between my daughter and a young being in the yard grass in the last light of August, about 2 sets of prints in the mud, one 8 inches, one 12.5, and what it meant that the larger set had stopped at the boundary, about a family that lived in those mountains and had lived in those mountains and had decided, after 7 weeks of watching, that the people on this farm could be trusted with the knowledge that they were there. I raised my hand. Open, held, visible. She looked at my raised hand. She looked at my face. She held position for a long moment in the March rain. Then she turned and walked back into the alders, and the alders closed behind her. And the gray Tuesday afternoon was just the gray Tuesday afternoon again. That was the last time. I spoke to Pearl Howard that autumn in her second-hand store in Hamilton. I had gone in for a winter coat for Patty and ended up staying 2 hours because Pearl Howard was the kind of woman who made you stay. We talked about the mountains above Hamilton, about the Forest Service land and the old-growth pockets, about the logging that kept pushing further east into the drainages. And Pearl said something that stopped me. She said that the old families in the area, the ones who had been there long enough, talked about certain things in the mountains in a particular way. Not openly, not in company, but in as facts about the terrain get passed down in families that work that terrain. Her grandfather had seen something on the North Fork in the early part of the century. She said he had described it afterward, specifically, and that the description had stayed in the family for 60 years because it was too specific and too certain to forget. She said the thing that stayed with him most was not the size, though the size was outside anything he had a reference for. It was the look it gave him. She said he called it a respect fear, not the fear you feel around a bear or a cougar, where the fear is about whether it intends to hurt you. The fear you feel around something that is clearly smarter than you and has a considered opinion about the situation. He said, it did not look at him like he was prey. It looked at him like he was a problem it had already solved. She folded a sweater on the counter and then said, without looking up, "You have seen something." I said, "I am not sure what I have seen." She said, "That is the honest answer. Most people who have seen something up there are not sure. The ones who are completely sure are usually wrong in one direction or the other. Either they are sure it was nothing, or they are sure it was a monster. Both of those are wrong." I paid for the coat and went home, and I thought about Pearl Howard's grandfather on the North Fork in the early years of the century, keeping what he had seen inside the family for decades, passing it down not as a story of horror or of proof, but as a fact about the mountains. The same kind of fact that the mountains are steep here, or the snow comes early in the upper drainage. A geographic truth about the terrain that belonged to the people who lived close enough to it to need to know. We were those people now. Glenn and I kept this between ourselves and Patty for 42 years. We did not tell Roy Barnes more than he needed to know. We kept the prints in Glenn's notebook and the notebook in the farm office. And when we sold the property in 2006 because Glenn's back made the dairy work no longer possible, we took the notebook with us to the house in Lyman where we spent the next 15 years. The bark piece with the ginger root and the salmon vertebra came with us too, in the same box, on the same closet shelf. Glenn passed in 2021, 76 years old. A lung complication that came on faster than either of us was ready for. He had his notebook with him in the last months, not writing in it, not showing it to anyone, just having it. On his nightstand beside the water glass and the reading glasses, the notebook full of print measurements and stride lengths and weather notes and times of arrival from a fall and winter 40 years before, when a young family had been learning what shared the mountains behind their farm. He held this knowledge well for 40 years. He was a good person to carry things with. Patty is 51. She lives in Bellingham and has been a wildlife ecologist for the state of Washington for 23 years, which she decided she wanted to do when she was 14 and has been working toward without detour ever since. Her focus is on cascade ecosystem dynamics, old-growth corridor fragmentation, large mammal movement patterns, the relationships between forest structure and the species that depend on it. She is very good at her work. She is particularly good at thinking about what moves through landscape that cannot be directly observed, and about the conditions that allow things to persist across decades without human record. She calls me on Sundays. We talk about the usual things. Her daughter, who is 16 and has recently taken up botany with a focus that Patty says she finds both recognizable and gratifying. The garden I keep at a smaller scale than I kept at the farm. The news, which I take in smaller quantities as the years go on. And sometimes, toward the end of the call, Patty will say something that tells me she is still carrying it, as I am still carrying it. She will mention a ridge she surveyed in the upper Skagit drainage and say she heard something at dusk that did not fit any species in her survey protocol. She will mention that she has started keeping a section in her field notebooks she calls unresolved observations, a category that does not exist in the official methodology, but that she keeps anyway, in her own handwriting in the back pages, because she thinks the honest record of what is actually out there requires it. She goes to the huckleberry thickets every August, alone, to the Cascade high country, where Vaccinium membranaceum comes in heavy above the timberline. She picks methodically and moves quietly and talks in the low, steady voice she has used since she was 9 years old in the presence of a presence that might be listening. She has never told me she has seen one again, but she has never once told me she has stopped believing the mountains hold them, and how she describes the August trips, the quality of attention she feels from the timber on certain days. The particular stillness that means the trees are inhabited even if nothing is visible tells me she goes back for more than the berries. She called last spring on a Sunday morning in April with the Bellingham rain coming down and the Pacific Northwest gray settled in over everything, and she said, "Mom, I think it is time." I said, "Time for what?" She said, "To tell it properly, not to prove anything, not to get anyone to do anything about it, just to say that it happened, and that it mattered, and that there are people who have been carrying it carefully for a long time." I sat at my kitchen table and I thought about the mother standing at the north tree line on a March Tuesday in the rain, looking at the house where the accommodation had been made and kept, not asking for anything, not offering anything beyond what her presence confirmed, that she had watched the farm through its season of contact, and that she had arrived at her conclusions, and that the conclusions were not hostile, the choosing to be seen. What that cost? I said, "All right, here is what I know. The Cascade Range above the Skagit River Valley of western Washington, the country east of Hamilton, where the farming ground gives way to the logged slopes and the logged slopes give way to old-growth Douglas fir and western red, cedar that has been standing since before any European walked. Through the Cumberland Gap, that country holds things that are not on any official record. It has held them for longer than the farms below it have existed, longer than the logging roads, longer than any human presence in that valley. The terrain above 4,000 feet, in the national forest land where the drainage systems branch into 6 and 7 separate creek systems and the ridgelines run for miles without any maintained trail, that terrain is inhabited, not by anything that appears on a wildlife survey or in a state database, but inhabited. A family group. I cannot tell you the precise number. Glenn counted 4 distinct vocal frequencies from the timber on the clearest evening he had for listening, and the 2 who came to our tree line were the only 2 we ever saw directly. But a family group that maintains vocal contact across a drainage system, that coordinates decisions about who approaches the human margin and who stays back, that places items on a porch step with care that distinguishes between the practical and the offered, that group has a social structure more complex. They are not violent. Every contact across 7 weeks of the fall of 1982 confirmed that. The closest the juvenile came to our house was the porch steps, 3 feet from the door, and it never reached for the door or for any person or for anything other than a bowl of berries that was placed there as an offer. The mother never entered the yard. The others never came to the tree line. Every limit was observed. Every limit was, as far as I could tell, self-imposed. A thing that sets its own limits and holds to them across multiple visits, multiple nights, multiple individuals maintaining those limits when nothing in the physical environment prevents crossing them is not operating by instinct alone. Instinct does not observe the boundaries it sets. Intelligence does. Those mountains have held this for a very long time, longer than Pearl Howard's grandfather, who saw one on the North Fork in the early years of the century and came home and described it in specific terms that his granddaughter still held 60 years later. Longer than the families who came before him, who built their farms at the foot of the same ridgelines and learned to give certain drainages a respectful birth without quite putting into words what they were respecting. The knowing has been here, in the people who have lived close enough to the mountains to need it, for as long as those mountains have had people living at their feet. There are practical things I want to say. For anyone who lives in mountain country and has witnessed an encounter they could not explain and have been carrying without knowing whether or how to speak of it. The first is that you are probably not wrong about what you observed. The second is that what you observed is not, based on my experience, a threat to you or to your family. The absence of fear that Patty and I both felt in encounters that should, by every reasonable measure, have frightened us, was not naivety or failure of perception. It was information. Our bodies read a truth in the encounter and arrived at a conclusion before our brains had time to argue with it. And the conclusion was that the thing in front of us had not come with harm in mind. The third is that the decision about what to do with what you know is yours, and it is not a simple one, and the weight of it is real. Carry it carefully. Let it settle before you act. The mountains are patient, and whatever you saw is more patient than the mountains. You can afford to take your time. The farm is someone else's now, has been for 18 years. The north alder tree line has grown taller in those years, and the logging road above the property has overgrown further back toward the gate. I have driven past twice since we sold the property, just to see. The yard looks different under different owners, but the north tree line looks the same. The gap between the two widest alders, where the juvenile used to stand and where the mother stood on that last October morning to be seen, that gap is still there. I do not know if the family is still in that drainage. I do not know if the juvenile, which would be well into its middle years now by any reasonable estimate, still ranges to the low margins of its territory in August, when the huckleberries are heavy. I do not know if the mother is still alive. She had gray at her shoulders in October of 1982, which suggested age, and whatever their lifespan is, 42 years is not a short interval. The Bigfoot community, the people who have spent serious time on this question, holds that they are long-lived, that aging operates on a different timeline for them than it does for us. I have no way to confirm that and no way to contradict it, but I know that the mountains east of Hamilton are still those mountains. They have not been made smaller or more accessible in the ways that would matter to a family group that has been navigating them for longer than any road or survey line. The old growth pockets the logging did not reach are still standing. The upper drainage systems that branch away from any maintained trail are still there, still holding whatever they have always held. And I know that when Patty calls on Sundays and mentions, toward the end, that she heard something in the upper Skagit drainage that she could not account for, that there was a quality of attention in the timber on a certain evening that her protocol did not have a category for, she is not describing fear. She is describing the thing she has been carrying since she was 9 years old in a mountain clearing, with her pail and her huckleberries, and a young being watching her from behind the thimbleberry bushes. She is describing the knowledge that she is not alone on those hillsides, that she has not been alone on any hillside. She has walked in these mountains since the August afternoon she came down the farm lane with her bootlaces dragging and set her half-full pail on the porch railing and said, "Mama, something followed me home from the berry patch. I am 74 years old. I have kept this story for 42 years. I have kept it because it needed keeping, because the thing that required keeping was alive in those mountains, and what the official world would have done to it, if it had known, was not something I was willing to have on my conscience. I have kept it because the mother stood at my north tree line on a March Tuesday in the rain and looked at the house where the accommodation had been made and kept, and that look was a confirmation, and confirmations carry obligations. I am telling it now because my daughter said it was time, and because she is right. The bark piece with the ginger root and the salmon vertebra is in a box in the closet behind me. The vertebra is lighter than it was in October of 1982, the calcium releasing slowly over 4 decades the way bone does when it is no longer protected by the body that made it. The ginger root has dried to a hard, dark knot. They are not proof of anything. They are the physical remainder of a gesture made by a being toward another being across a distance that neither of them could measure in units they shared. A mother introducing herself to the family her young one had decided to trust. What came to the porch at dusk was not a monster and not a myth. It was a young being that sat cross-legged in the yard grass of a dairy farm in the Skagit foothills and ate huckleberries one at a time from a bowl my daughter set on the porch step. It was the mother who watched from the timber to make sure her child was safe. It was the whole of what those behaviors imply about the minds behind them and the social world those minds inhabit. They are in those mountains. They have always been in those mountains. The country east of Hamilton, above the Skagit River, where the logging roads end and the old growth begins and the ridgelines run for miles without any trail to mark them, that country holds something that has no intention of leaving and has never had any need to ask our permission to stay. Patty goes to the huckleberry thickets every August. She picks methodically and keeps her voice low and gives the timber the space the timber is asking for. And some years, she tells me, the attention from the trees is stronger than others. A quality in the stillness that means the stillness is inhabited. Glenn kept his notebook until the very end. I found it on his nightstand after he passed, where it had been for the last months of his life, and I sat in the chair beside the bed and read through it from the beginning. The first entries were from the morning after Patty's encounter, the measurements from the clearing, the stride calculations, his notes on the berry leavings. The handwriting was the same handwriting he used for everything, for the equipment maintenance logs, for the milk production records, for the grocery lists he carried to the concrete market. Careful, consistent, his own, and the same quality of attention he brought to anything worth knowing. No drama, no emphasis, just the facts and their measurements and the date. The last entry about the family and the timber was from the February morning when he saw them on the ridge, moving east. He wrote the time, the direction of travel, the weather. He wrote that both figures moved with the pace and purpose of a being that knew where it was going. He wrote, mother and juvenile, moving into upper drainage, heading east into national forest land. No distress, purposeful. That was the last entry. After that, the notebook had pages of the ordinary farm record: milk yields, equipment maintenance, pasture rotation notes. Life continued. The dairy ran. Carl grew up and went to school and eventually moved to Bellingham for work. Patty went to university in Bellingham for wildlife ecology and never came back to the valley to live, though she came back to visit. Glenn's back got worse and then worse again, and in 2006, we sold the farm to a young couple from Bellingham who wanted to try dairy and who were still running it. I heard, though with more automation than Glenn would have used. The mountains east of Hamilton stayed the same. That is the thing about mountains, they do not accommodate our timelines. The drainage systems above the farm are the same drainage systems they have always been, running the same water through the same terrain that has been running water through it since the glaciers finished their work 10,000 years ago. The old-growth Douglas fir above the logged slopes is the same old growth it has always been. The trees that survived the 1950s and 60s cuts continuing their centuries. The 4,000-foot country in the national forest above the farm is the same unreachable in any practical sense terrain it has always been. The ridge lines running for miles with no maintained trail. The upper drainages branching into the complexity that resists any systematic documentation. Whatever is in those mountains is in those mountains. Whatever conclusion the family arrived at about the farm and its people, that conclusion is part of the territory's history now. The way all the history of a place is part of it without being visible in it. We were here. They were here. The overlap lasted one season. The season mattered. She does not close the distance. She does not look for the source. The notebook is in the same box as the bark piece. I have not been able to put them in separate places. They belong together as the evidence of a thing and the meaning of a thing belong together. The measurements Glenn made are the evidence. And what those measurements pointed to is the meaning, and what we did with both of them across 42 years is the part of the story that is hardest to put into words because it is the part that does not have events attached to it. It is the part that is just the carrying. There is a quality to carrying a significant knowledge for a long time that I did not understand when we were young. I thought it would be a burden. I thought the not telling would create a pressure that would eventually demand release. But it did not work that way. What happened instead was that the knowledge became part of the structure of how we understood the world, as any formative experience becomes structural. We did not carry it as you carry a weight. We carried it as you carry a perspective, not as something added on top of normal life, but as something built into the foundation of how normal life read to us. Glenn saw the mountains differently after October of 1982. Not dramatically, not with any obvious behavioral change. He still drove the logging road to check the upper pasture water line. He still hunted in November in the high country east of the farm. He still said hello to the mountains in the mornings when the light first hit the snowfields above the old growth, which he had done since he was a boy. But he saw them with an additional layer of knowledge behind his looking, and that knowledge changed the texture of what the mountains meant to him. They were not simply terrain, they were inhabited. The specific, particular quality of that inhabitedness, a family group with its own language and its own social structure and its own methods of assessment and decision-making, was now part of what Glenn saw when he looked east from the farm. And I think this is what Pearl Howard's grandfather carried too in the early years of the century on the North Fork, and what Pearl carried after him, and what the old families in the valley carried in how facts about the terrain get passed down by people who need the facts because they live in the terrain. The mountains were inhabited, not in a frightening way, in the way that was true. I want to be honest about one more thing before I finish, and this is the part that has been hardest to put into words across 42 years of occasionally trying. In the September weeks before the first Porch sighting, during the period when the juvenile was coming to the tree line and Glenn and I were sitting on the porch watching without seeing anything on most evenings, there were nights when I sat in my chair and looked at the dark tree line and felt, without any particular evidence for it, that I was being regarded, not watched in, as a prey animal is watched by a predator, regarded in the fuller sense, taken into account, considered, evaluated as a subject rather than an object. It was a feeling I had no prior framework for, and that I could not verify by any observation. But it was consistent, night after night, and it was specific, not a general sense of being outdoors after dark near a forest, but a specific sense of directed attention from a specific direction. Looking back from 42 years of subsequent knowledge, I believe that feeling was accurate. I believe the mother was in those trees on most of those evenings, watching us watch the tree line, running her assessment of the people her young one had decided to trust. And I believe that what I was picking up was not imagination but some genuine signal, some trace of that attention that reached me below the level of conscious perception. I do not know what channel that signal traveled. I do not have a scientific framework for it. I am just telling you what I felt, and that what I felt, over the months that followed, was confirmed by everything that happened. She was already there, already watching, already deciding, and she decided that we could be trusted. That is the whole of it. In the end, a family in the mountains decided, based on careful observation over many weeks, that a family on a farm below them could be trusted. The evidence they gathered was Glenn and me on the porch in the dark, and Patty with her bowl of berries, and Carl in his high chair with his wooden spoon, and the dogs doing their half-alarm and then settling, and the yard light off and the door open and the hands visible and open. All of the ordinary evidence of an ordinary family doing the ordinary things of an ordinary life, read by an intelligence that needed to know if that ordinariness was safe. It was safe. We were safe. They were right. And the gift on the bark piece, the berries and the ginger root and the old salmon vertebra kept for reasons we would never fully know, that was the evidence that the decision had been made, and that the mother wanted us to know it had been made, and that the knowing mattered to her for reasons that mapped, however imperfectly, onto the reasons it mattered to us. They are still there. I am as sure of that as I am sure of anything. And someday, in the huckleberry thickets in August, my daughter will set her pail down on the granite shelf and stand still in the clearing, and the forest will hold whatever it holds, and she will pick her berries and be present and give whatever is watching the space to do whatever it decides to do. And that will be enough. That has always been enough. She picks her berries and she keeps herself present as she learned to keep herself present when she was 9 years old, calmly, without threat, with the honest acknowledgement that she is a guest in a place that belongs to someone else. She has not seen one again, but she has never stopped believing they see her, and I have not either. And I do not expect to, for whatever time I have left in these mountains, At the foot of this particular piece of the Cascade Range that watched a dairy farm for a season 42 years ago and made a decision about the people on it and honored that decision every year since. They are patient, they are intelligent, they are still there. And somewhere in the deep timber above the Skagit River Valley, a family that has never needed our acknowledgement to exist is going on existing, as it has always done, in the last of the places the world has not yet thought to look.